the purpose was basically to present to our membership and our audience a presentation of the budget numbers, the estimates that were presented to Parliament, and that were the basis for discussions about allocations to various ministries. And this discussion was led by a program, the Public Finance Management Program of the Institute of Economic Affairs, which tracks budget policy and expenditure. At that meeting, we discussed 4 things. First was basically the budget outturn, which is basically how the budget numbers add up together, how much money government was raising. And we learned that government would be raising from revenues about 2.1 trillion Kenyan shillings, spending a total of 3.6 trillion, leaving us with a deficit before grants of about 1.5 trillion Kenyan shillings. And then we went into the financing mechanisms, and for the coverage of that gap of 1.5 trillion shillings, we learned from that most of that money will be covered from a small amount of grants, but the rest of it would be covered from borrowing, both domestic and foreign. We also knew that the primary deficit, having taken out the amount of money the government would be spending in paying back loans, or rather obligations, but more specifically the interest component, would leave the deficit at about 7.8, just slightly less than 8% of gross domestic product. Then we went into the sectoral allocations, seeing which are the priority sectors, all the way across what are they called, the medium-term expenditure framework sectors, the 10 specific areas in which all government operations, public sector operations are divided, and then into how much money was being distributed according to the equitable share required by the Constitution towards all county governments for expenditure and provision of public services as required by devolution. And then we discussed the policy implications of some of those expenditures. Then the final part was basically the finance bill and specific proposals for how government would be raising money, or proposes to raise money with Parliament's approval to fund to change budget policy, to change rather taxation policy, bringing in new areas of revenues, and obviously trying to close some gaps. So that was the agenda for last week. In broad terms, it told us that I think the momentum for the growth of the public budget is huge. Last year's total expenditure was about slightly less than 3 trillion. This year, it's 20% larger. And so today we'd like to discuss a couple more detail by going into specific sectors and the judiciary and specifically Parliament. And this is led by our Constitution Law and the Economy program, led by Jacqueline Kagume and her colleague Leo Kemboi. As you can see on the program, our 23rd webinar of the year will be discussing the judiciary and Parliament, and specifically because these are the sectors, or specifically the arms of government, that are tracked by this program. So the presentation is divided into 2. The first part of the presentation will come from Jacqueline, and she'll talk about the budgets and the allocations to judiciary, some comparative data, and some conclusions that could be drawn from the focus, or what areas, or rather the funding quantum for the judiciary. And then the second part of the conversation will be led by my colleague Leo Kemboi, who's an assistant program officer, and what he'll be speaking about is Parliament and the independent institutions. As I said, last week's presentation was heavy on the executive branch and specifically on devolution. And so today we are focusing on the other arms of government, specifically the judiciary, Parliament itself, and the independent institutions, or as we call them, Chapter 15 institutions, because most of them are defined in Chapter 15 of the independent institutions that are defined in Chapter 15 of the Constitution. And after that, then we'll open up for a question and answer session, and hope that we can close by 12:30 at the latest. So thanks again for being here, and I'll pass it now to Jackie for the presentation. Jackie, go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Kagume, and as has been stated, I'll be making the first part of today's presentation. You've heard from the introduction and the background that Today we'll be sharing our analysis of the budgets of key institutions that are established by the Constitution. And specifically, we'll be looking at the Judiciary and Parliament. So this is a presentation that has been prepared by IEA's Constitution, Law and Economy program, just as a follow-up to the presentation that we had last week, led by our PFM program. So we'll give our highlights of the Judiciary and Parliament, and then we'll also give some highlights regarding the commissions and other independent agencies that are established by the Constitution. So I'll go straight now to our presentation. So that's the outline. That's the outline of our presentation today. And I'll start by outlining the legal framework on budgets. And this is basically as it's been provided by the Constitution and statute. For statute, we'll be looking at the PFM Act. I'll then discuss our analysis of the key trends for the Judiciary's budget. Thereafter, as has already been stated, then my colleague will present on our analysis of Parliament's budgets and then highlights of those other independent offices established by the Constitution. We'll then make our conclusions and wrap up. So going to the legal framework on budgets, this is where I start. And the reason why we thought that it would be important just to highlight this, as the Law and Economy program at IEA, we thought it would be useful to just start by reminding all of us what's the basis or what's the legal basis for the how budgets are formulated and the entire institutional and legal framework. So first, we have the overarching framework, which is provided by the Constitution. And specifically, while stating the roles of the National Assembly under Article 95, the Constitution provides that one of the roles of the National Assembly is to appropriate funds for expenditure by the national government and other national state organs. So that's 95(4)(b). Then the Constitution, on a broad basis, also establishes the processes. And regarding process, in Article 221(1), it requires that at least 2 months before the end of each financial year, the CS responsible for finance is required to submit to the National Assembly the estimates of revenue and expenditure of the national government for the next financial year. Then separately, we have Article 127, 6C, which requires the Parliamentary Service Commission to prepare annual estimates again of the expenditure of the parliamentary service and forward them to the National Assembly for approval. Then similarly, we then have Article 173.3, which provides regarding the Judiciary that for each financial year, the Chief Registrar of the Judiciary shall prepare estimates of expenditure for the following year and submit them to Parliament for approval. So you note that the Article 221(1), when it talks about the CS Finance submitting his estimates, this excludes those of the Parliamentary Service Commission and those of the Judiciary, which are required by law to be submitted separately. Then once the estimates are submitted to the National Assembly, Article 221(3) and 221(6) provide that after consideration and approval of those estimates, so the three sets, those of the national government, the Judiciary, and Parliament, that those estimates shall then be included in an appropriation bill. Then subsequently, the appropriation bill is introduced again in the National Assembly, just for purposes of authorizing the withdrawal of the funds that will be required to implement from the consolidated fund. So that's in terms of the Constitution, the framework provided by the Constitution. We look briefly on the PFM Act. And here, as expected, statutes basically elaborate what has already been provided by the Constitution. So the Act provides for the finer details regarding the processes and procedures. If we start with the section 35, it basically outlines the stages in the budget process, which I'm sure most of us can almost easily recite. And this is from the planning processes that are detailed for the formulation. So then to the approval, to implementation, and lastly to evaluation and audit. Then we go to section 37.2 of the PFM Act, which then reiterates the processes and procedures that I've talked about that are laid out in terms of how the CS Finance is supposed to prepare the estimates of national government. And here, again, I just remind you that national government here is primarily the executive, because the other two arms of government are required to submit their estimates separately. So section 37.3 spells out the processes for preparation of Parliament's estimates. Then section 37.4 of the Act then provides that the Chief Registrar of the Judiciary shall no later than the 30th of April in each financial year submit to the National Assembly the budget estimates for the Judiciary, including proposed appropriations. So as the Chief Registrar submits these statements to the Treasury, they are also supposed to submit a copy of those same documents to the CS Finance. And this is a similar process even for the Parliamentary Service Commission. So they also submit their statements to Treasury, but with a copy to the CS Finance. And then the CS Finance is supposed to review those statements and send any comments that he or she may have to the National Assembly regarding the copy of the statements that they received. So in case they have any comments, they're supposed to submit those no later than the 15th of May. So the National Assembly then considers the estimates in their totality, and the processes that I laid out on Article 221 then come in. So, and this is in terms of once they are considered, then the approval is done, then the appropriation bill, and that's the process. So we thought it would be important to start with just a quick reminder of that process. So we go to the next slide. So having looked at the legal background informing the formulation of budgets, the next thing we look at is the trends, rather the overall trends in terms of the proportions of the total budget allocation. And I think for those of you who attended the webinar that Kwame spoke about last week, you may be familiar with this first chart because it was presented then, and we thought we'd restate it here just for purposes of context. And the chart basically highlights the overall national budget and decomposes it to its main proportions. So as you can see from this chart, the national executive seems to consistently take up the largest share of the budget. And this is illustrated by the pink section of the bars from the financial year 2016-17 all the way to 2021-22. However, you can see that this has reduced from 66%, what was the proportion in 2016-17, to 52% in the upcoming year. So the second main allocation that we can see here is towards the consolidated fund services, and this consumes the second largest share of the budget, and this has grown from 21% in the financial year 2016-17 to 36% in 2021-22. Again, if you attended that webinar last week, my colleague Noah gave some compelling reasons regarding why we see the expanding CFS, noting that among the main drivers for this is debt service. And this, among other things, one of the main drivers that we discussed last week was debt service. And the logic behind these proportions is that if one grows, then it's likely that another may shrink. So the point that my colleague was trying to make last week was that with the expanding CFS and the pressure that is exerted by the debt service, this likely translates to less flexibility in the remainder of the budget, since the CFS, as you all know, carries the mandatory payments. So that's where we see those shifts. Then the blue part of the bars represents county allocations, and here we don't see major significant shifts in terms of the proportions. But just having broadly said that, our primary interest today, though, is the judiciary and parliament. And looking at this chart, you may actually struggle to identify the proportions of these two institutions, but because they're the tiny lines at the top of those bars. From our analysis, Parliament's share is about 1% for the coming year, while that of the judiciary will be about 0.5%. And so that's less for the judiciary at 0.5%, that's less than 1%. And this has been the average that we have seen for the last few years. So that is trying to put the judiciary's budget and Parliament's in context of the broader total national budget. We go to the next slide. So this slide basically illustrates the estimates for this for the governance, the justice, law and order sector, what is known as the GJLOs. So given the institutions that the CLE program focuses on, we thought it would be essential to just mention or look at the estimates for the GJLOs, because this is the sector that plays a central role in terms of establishing and maintaining a favorable environment for the economic and social and political stability in the country. That is actually stated as the main objective statement of the GJLO sector. So for the financial year 2021-22, the overall sector allocation is estimated at 217 billion shillings, and this is an 8.5 increase from the 200 billion allocation that was there in 2020-21. If you look at those bars, the State Department for Interior and Citizen Services receives the largest share within the sector, with an allocation of 64% for this coming year, which will be a slight decrease from the 66% in 2020-21. We note here carefully that over the years, the economic classification that was done by government used to include the judiciary under the GJLOs until most recently, since the judiciary now prepares its budgets independently. But we still thought that it would be useful for purposes of our analysis to compare the judiciary's allocation to that of other bodies with related functions, so within the GJLOs. So the judiciary allocation within this sector is estimated at 8% of the overall sector allocation, which is just about a 2% decrease from the financial year 2020-21. Then we go to the next slide. So here we'll be looking at the judiciary's now estimated expenditure. And this chart illustrates that the judiciary's budget allocation for 2021-22 is estimated at 17.92 billion shillings. So this is a 6.18% decrease from the 19.1 billion, which was the initial estimates for the financial year 2020-21. However, we'd like to note here that what this chart is illustrating is the trends in the estimates, not the actual allocation of what they received. So the actual allocation for the judiciary for 2020-21, after various revisions, ended up at around 17.42 billion. But we are just comparing here, looking at the trends in the overall estimates. So given what was estimated last year to what we have as the projection for this year, they're supposed to receive 17.92 billion shillings. Then That's on the first stack of bars, which looks at the proportions. So the second stack of bars indicates that the judiciary's estimates represent per capita allocation of 358 shillings for the financial year 2021. 358 shillings for 2021-22, compared to the slightly higher 389 shillings that was allocated in 2020-21. If you compare this to the other two arms of government, of course, this is the lowest, with the budget for Parliament representing about 756 shillings for the per capita allocation, and Leo will talk about this in detail. Then the third stack shows that as a share of GDP, the judiciary allocation has also dropped. So for the financial year 2021-22, it's going to be, or it's projected at 0.145%. And this is a slight drop from the 0.171% in 2020-21. Then we go to the next slide. And the next thing that we looked at was the judiciary absorption and utilization rates. So if you look at these charts, the top part illustrates the trends in the absorption rates. So we see here that over the last 4 years, the judiciary's absorption rate has been high for the recurrent expenditure, with an average absorption rate of about 94%. That's looking at the top, the bars in the top chart. So this is a bit in contrast with the development expenditure, where we note some significant shifts in terms of the absorption rates. So we had 67% in 2016-17, to 106% in 2017-18, followed again by a sharp drop to 44% in 2018-19, and about 78% in 2019-20. Here we'd like to just state that how we extracted these absorption rates from the Controller of Budget reports. And in those reports, the absorption rate here is calculated as the ratio of the actual expenditure against the estimates for the period of review. And here, in our thinking, the rationale is basically to try and approximate the extent to which budget implementation is occurring as a share of what had been, rather the estimates that were provided, so the total budget estimates. So we see those trends for the top chart. Then for the second, or the lower part of these charts, we looked at the budget utilization rates. So we distinguished the absorption rates from the utilization rates, given that now, as I've stated, the absorption just calculates the expenditure out of what was the estimates. But when it comes to utilization rates, it's basically expenditure as a ratio of the money that the institutions actually have, or the funds that are actually available to the institution. That's the exchequer issues. So here we calculated the expenditure as a fraction of the exchequer issues. So basically what they have and not what was allocated. And here the picture is a bit different, especially if you look at the development side. So actually the utilization rates for both the recurrent and development votes for the judiciary are high, are significantly high. And you see that for the recurrent, it starts at around 98% in 2016-17 to 99% in 2019-20. So, and this is even higher. Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. And this is even higher for the development vote. So the utilization seems to, for the development vote, if you calculate the average for those 4 years that we've provided, it comes to an average of about 135%. So, and because I know someone may ask, how can it be over 100%? In our thinking, this high utilization rate could be, it could be a factor of several things, but most likely one of the things could be, for instance, additional funds that were received, say, from development partners. So besides the exchequer releases, sometimes the judiciary and also other institutions receive some funds from other development partners, and this may indicate, if you calculate the expenditure over the exchequer releases, this may indicate a rate that is higher than 100% because they have additional funds from other sources. So that was that was part of our rationale, trying to rationalize why that could be, the numbers that we see could be so. So those are the absorption rates for the judiciary and the utilization rates, and we see if you look at the utilization rates, they seem to be sufficiently high. Then we go to the next slide, and here we looked at the resource requirements for the judiciary versus the allocations. So basically, here what we are looking at is what is allocated to the judiciary vis-a-vis what they ask Parliament or what they present to Parliament as their resource requirement. And we thought it would be useful because we've all had the consistent arguments or narrative that the judiciary has been underfunded. We've had this from them, the institution itself. It has been in the public domain. So we thought we'd just compare what they've been asking for against what they've been receiving. So if you look at this table, as you can see, right from 2017-18, the judiciary's resource requirement for that year was stated at 35.95 billion, and what they were allocated was 17.56 billion. And here we see that the shortfall, basically the difference between what was their resource requirement and what was allocated, the shortfall was 18.39 billion. And for that financial year, it represented 51% of their total resource requirement. So this is basically more than half of their total resource requirement. Then in 2018-19, they requested for 31.17 billion. The allocation for that year was 17.3 billion. Again, a shortfall of 13.86 billion, representing a 44% shortfall in terms of their total resource requirement. Then similar trends we see for the subsequent years. In 2019-20, they requested 23 billion, received 18. The shortfall there was 4 billion, and the shortfall as a share of the resource requirement was 19 billion. Then last year, for the last financial year, or the current one actually that we are wrapping up, the resource requirement was 37.42 billion. The allocation was 19.1, and the shortfall was therefore 18 billion, and as a percentage, again, almost 50%, but it's 49%. Then for the coming year that we are reviewing now, for the financial year 2021-22, they had requested 35.3 billion, and the allocation that we have seen for this year, again, is 17.92 billion. The difference there, which is the shortfall, is 17.4 billion, and this again represents a 49% difference in terms of as a share of their total resource requirement. So basically, the judiciary is telling Parliament that we require 37 billion to be able to effectively and efficiently discharge of our functions, which is the administration of justice, which is the resolution of disputes, which is the management of the cases and the reduction of the case backlog. But Parliament, in their wisdom, tells them that what we have available is 17 billion. So that's half. So effectively, on one way, you could look at it that they're basically operating at 50% or almost at 50% of the capacity, the optimum capacity that, according to their own self-assessment, they're operating at 50% of the resource capacity that they would require. So we thought that it would be important to include this table in our analysis because of course, there are serious ramifications for underfunding an institution as critical as the judiciary. So remember that this is a separate one of the three arms of government, so it's a separate arm of government. And with the severe underfunding, it's likely that they would be significantly hampered from properly executing their functions. And this basically brings me now to my key messages, which is my last slide. And here, the key messages that I only make two main conclusions based on the analysis that we provided for the judiciary's budget. The one glaring one, and which again we've illustrated with the data and which you may have heard over time, is the significant underfunding. And I've just demonstrated this by looking at the resource requirement versus allocation. So as I've stated, this under-resourcing is likely to significantly impede the performance of key functions, with the current allocation basically facilitating just around half of the major operations of the judiciary. So that's the first one. And someone would ask how sure are we that the institution actually requires this much resources, and we'll say that the response that we could attempt for this is the costing that the judiciary has provided for their resource requirement is on a basis of funding their strategic plan. So from their own self-assessment, to properly implement the things that they intend to do according to their strategic plan, these are the resources that they require. We have not yet come across a specific study that highlights properly the extent or the level of judiciary funding, or the extent to which any judiciary should be funded. But we think it's an important thing that should be considered, and we is one of the things that we're looking at doing as a program and as the IEA, just basically trying to cost functions so that we have a well-informed, rather data-driven, evidence-driven argument for the resource requirements of the judiciary based on a proper needs assessment, so that the institution can perform at its optimum, at its best. So basically, what we have here is based on the judiciary's own assessment of what their resource requirements are, but we still feel that it would also be important to have other independent actors basically undertaking costs, a costing of the various functions to provide that evidence. Then the other thing that I draw as a conclusion or a key message is on the high, the utilization rates that we've seen for the judiciary. So we've seen sufficiently high utilization rates, and I stated that this is basically a calculation of the extent to which they are implementing their budget. So basically the expenditure as a fraction of, or rather as a ratio of the funds that are available to them. So given those high utilization rates, I think it's an indication of capacity for implementation. So this should be an incentive for Parliament to allocate more resources to the judiciary, since they have demonstrated, based on their utilization rates, they've demonstrated their capacity to utilize their budgets and basically implement. So I think it would be important for Parliament to allocate more or sufficient resources moving towards what has been indicated as the resource requirement. I'll stop there. And that's the first part of the presentation, and I'll ask my colleague Leo to come in now and make the second part of the presentation. Thank you.
Yeah, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Leo Kimboy from the Institute of Economic Affairs. I work together with Jackie, under the Constitutional Law and Economy program. So I'll now start to explain, to lay out Parliament's budget. And one of the things that for Parliament as an institution is important for budget tracking because of the three main functions they play in the economy. Apart from the main one being providing checks and balances to all arms of government. The second one being they're the pass holders, so they approve budgets. And the third one is that basically they impose taxes. And those are key things that matter to every Kenyan on a day-to-day basis. So one of the things that we think that it's very important for people to understand is how Parliament is funded. So this is from a past question that was asked to IEA because particularly you'd see three things in the appropriations bill, which because the appropriation bill lays out MDAs using so you'll see Parliamentary Service Commission, you see the National Assembly vote 2142, and the Parliamentary Joint Services 2043. And the Parliamentary Joint Services include what they call the Joint Services and the Center for Parliamentary Services and Center for Parliamentary Services and Studies and Training. So this is a new introduction. There's the bill that was done in 2019 called the Parliamentary Service Act that lays out the three main votes. So the Senate is funded through the Parliamentary Service Commission. So we'd have so many. For myself, I have a view about this, and the main issue is that based on the structure of our constitution, Parliament, the respective houses of Parliament should be funded, and the Constitutional Commission, Parliamentary Service Commission, should be funded separately as a way of enhancing institutional strength. So, and this coming year, the 21 for this budget year, the PSC will be implementing 4 programs under the 3 votes. So the Senate Affairs Program, the National Legislation, Representation and Oversight, then the General Administration, and then Legislative Training and Knowledge Management. So let's go to this year's Parliament estimated expenditure. This year's budget would stay at 37.88 billion, and this is for the financial year 21-22. This is a slight deviation from the 2020-21, and In 2020-21, it was 39.15 billion. And one thing to say about that is on the side of proposals is that Parliament's budget has grown extensively over time in the last 6 years. On the other side, the second stack of charts is the per capita. And if you note, this year's per capita spending would be Kenya shillings 756. That is almost 2.4 times higher than what Judiciary spends. So, and then on the third stack, it's as a share of GDP. It's around, for this financial year, using the new GDP figures, Kenya shillings 12.3 trillion. This would be around 0.331%. So that is the overall outlay of Parliament's budget. On the absorption and utilization rates, as Jackie had explained, absorption is the ratio of expenditure over the estimates, the overestimated expenditure. So the main reason to measure this is to look at reasons, to look at how the uptake of funds, the uptake of resources compared to what was allocated to them, and this mainly speaks to that capacity. So from 2016-17, the Parliament's budget has ranged. So for example, in 2019-20, the absorption rate was 82%, which is a slight drop from 2018-19 on the recurrent side. On the development side, the absorption rate has been improving, and it was 45% in 2016-17, went up to 50. Now in 2019-20, for the latest available figures, it's at 95%. On the utilization side, which is now expenditure over the exchequer issues, and the exchequer issues is disbursements. So if you look at from 2016-17, on the recurrent side, the utilization rate has been well above 100%, and for the latest year that figures were available for, which is 2019-20, the utilization rate was 103%, which the exchequer issues being 28 billion, and what was utilized, exchequer issues being 27 billion, and what was utilized was 28 billion. On the development side, we see some significant difference, and this from 106% in 2016-17 to 100% in 2019-20, which is the latest latest available figures. But there is a huge jump in 2018-19, and because Parliament has been having a very big project, which is the office block for members of Parliament, and that, I think that jump in 2018-19 could be explained by such a significant jump in utilization rates. So that's basically for Parliament. For Parliament. So I'll go ahead and explain about the constitutional commissions, and then I'll conclude with the key messages, what I see for both Parliament and what we see for both Parliament and constitutional commissions. So, as we all know, the functions of these commissions are set out in Chapter 15 of the Constitution, and the reason why they're called the Chapter 15 commissions is because they have a very specific clause, and these include the commissions and independent officers. So these commissions are not subject to direction of any person or any institution. And the reason why we track them is because based on that in level of independence that the Constitution explicitly gives them, they could make decisions that actually are not favorable to other players, especially from other branches of government. So we know that their first budget weaponization in the past. This includes SRC, the National Gender and Equality Commission, Kenya Human Rights Commission. We all remember, and I know this was discussed extensively in the Kenyan public affairs discourse when the SRC opposed some of the allowances, for example, that Parliament had allocated to themselves. The members of Parliament, what they did was to slash their budget. So I also know that the Constitutional Commission they play an important role in running independent institutions and checking excesses of those institutions. For this case, we cannot, for example, the Judicial Service Commission, and then the independent offices is essential for accountability on use of public funds. This is mainly the control of budget and the Auditor General. And then other commissions perform unique functions that are not performed by any other. This includes the SRC and the National Arts Commission. So they are very important part of our public finance management structure. So we look at for this year. So as you note, we've ranked them by, as you can see, we've ranked them by those ones with the biggest budgets to those ones with the small budgets. I note that that for this case, we've not put the ones like the Teacher Service Commission. We've isolated the small ones that could. So for IBC, it has received a 200 for this financial year 21 for the coming financial year 2021-22. That's received a 247 budget increase from 4.4 billion to 14.46 billion. As anticipated, the IBC will begin the election process, the election preparation process, and also start the referendum process. The second institution here is the Independent Office of the Auditor General, which has received 5.86 billion, which is a 12% change from the previous year. The Ethics and Anti-Corruption Commission is the third one with an increase of 7%. And then the fourth institution, the Public Service Commission, which is 2.28 billion, which is a change of 7%. The National Police Service Commission and the Independent IPOA received an increase of 21 and 18% respectively. So all these, the only institution that had the slightest change is the Judicial Service Commission, which is a 0.something%, which is almost close to 1%, from 576 to 580 million. Commission of Administrative Justice, which received an 8% increase, and then so the total, the Kenya National Human Rights and National and Gender Equality Commission, what we should all note is that for this year, the total received 32%. One thing to note is that the budgets for these commissions shifted by close to 15%, but the national budget now together executive for all arms of government shifted by 25%. So from almost 3.1 trillion to 3.6 trillion. So you should know that although you see some changes here for these commissions, the budget, the overall budget is moving faster than for these commissions. So one thing that the changes in one of the first key messages is that the changes in allocations to constitutional commissions and independent offices are still smaller compared to overall MDS. But the caveat is this: as the Institute of Economic Affairs, we don't usually claim that budgets should go up indiscriminately. What we argue for is that they should be although budget should go, the amount of resources appropriated by Parliament or allocated by Parliament to these institutions should be proportionate to their functions, so that it's not indiscriminate. Another thing is that the budgets we note for the IBC are for the referendum and election preparations. And then now the third thing I note is a political economic question. Now, if you noted that the big jumps, the big increases in the allocations for Parliament and Executive, what it shows on the other side is that Parliament, the gravity of the case backdrop problem, and generally the underfunding that they question, then the resource requirement question for Judiciary, that Parliament has not grasped the gravity of that problem. And then for the constitutional purposes, is to insist that there should be a principle of equitable sharing of resources among arms of government. And this is a serious policy concern, because Judiciary, which essentially provides justice to Kenyans, and Parliament, which represents the people, and while the executive on this other side now provides those basic services, those public goods to Kenyans, all these arms of government play an important role. And the thing that Kenyans wishes the Constitution anticipates, and what everyone wishes to see, is that the three arms, the sharing of resources to these entities should now be something that should be something that Parliament, in its wisdom, should be able to deal with, because they are the pass holders, and being the representatives of the people. If justice lags, which is also another form of public good, which is another form of good that is provided to the people, just like what the executive provides, it's a problem for the economy. And then finally, now this is to just as a closing point for the presentation, is that the Judicial Service Commission should demonstrate more the opportunity cost of the shortfall in the allocations. In the chart, that the table that Jackie showed, is that we should know that what happens if a billion less is not given to Judiciary. What does that shortfall of $1 billion mean? For example, does it mean that some cases won't be heard? Does it mean that, for example, some of the conflicts that could have been resolved more quickly and not, what does it mean? So that is an argument that should be made. Thank you so much, and that is the end of the presentation.
All right. Thanks, Jackie and Leo. So let me try and sum up. This presentation is divided into two parts. The first part specifically addressed the allocation trends to the judiciary, I think comparing 2 years. No, a little more than that. And then it told us what share, I think was a fascinating information on what there are increases, rather that the total public sector spending showed an increase both as a share of GDP and total spending in nominal terms and as a share of GDP. However, the allocations to the judiciary, both in nominal terms, on per capita terms, and then as a share of total spending, has been falling. So basically, that's the allocations to the judiciary. I think the same picture was shown for the independent commissions, if you take all that data together, suggesting to us that most of the increase in allocation, which has been fairly aggressive over the last few years in nominal terms, but also in real terms, has been ending up with the judiciary. And I think this ties up back again to allocations that have to be, non-discretionary expenditure, obviously because of the debt question. Now, the reason I mention that is because it's evident now that regardless of what we think, the possibility of allocations to other sectors is heavily constrained by the requirements under the Consolidated Fund Services, which mostly pays for non-discretionary items such as debt, primarily, and obviously the pensions questions, showing that because the budget is a single thing, I think it's essential for those who track the budgets of independent offices and the judiciary to be conscious of the fact that the non-discretionary expenditure portion of overall public spending is increasing. And that would constrain, regardless of what the justification for the needs would be, all available resources for the public sector to spend in judicial services and to spend in the services that are provided by the other independent offices. So that became a salient point for me. I think the data is also presented to show the absorption and utilization rates, and which are quite impressive for both, again, for the first presentation and the second, because in both cases, one of the factors that we see in the public sector in Kenya generally is that absorption rates for recurrent expenditure is usually very high. In all cases, usually more than 90%, and it's clear why, because salaries are easy to account for, or at least there are systems in place that allow for salaries to be paid. And people have an incentive in the public sector as well to make sure that salaries are paid promptly. So obviously that quantum and that allocation for salaries rarely is unspent. However, what we saw here is, again, both for the two presentations, that resource requirements, resource allocation for resource utilization and utilization rates are very high. In one place, I saw that the utilization for development funding for Parliament was 171%. That's on slide 13. And that really shocked me because I don't know how to process that. And I think you tried to explain it by saying that, look, there are some cases in which this is projects, but this is development. So it's suggesting that if 100 shillings was set for developments for that year, or allocations had been made for 100 shillings, the spending at the end of the year was 171. That's very, very interesting, reminding me that perhaps I should ask Jackie and Leo to check about what the findings of the Auditor General would be for that specific year. It was 2018 and 19 regarding that utilization. And then now to the shortfalls. I think we dealt with the shortfalls regarding the judiciary more specifically. And it's saying that consistently over the last 4 or 5 years, the judiciary has received an allocation from Parliament that is at least 50%, just about 50% of what the request has been, which is interesting. Of course, there was 1 year in which it was a little less, but basically it shows that the judiciary usually seeks about 30 billion and above, in some cases 34, 35. It's 29 or thereabouts, and usually receives a figure between 14, 17, and 19 on occasion, suggesting that there's a consistent funding or allocation from Parliament of just about 49% of what the judiciary requires. That's an interesting thing to explain. Now, my colleagues are explaining this by saying that it suggests there's inadequate funding of the judiciary. And they give the good example that because the judiciary seems to have high allocation, in spite of that allocation, seems to have high absorption, and directing that absorption to good, to service delivery, it suggests that there's a shortage of funding for some of the services that the judiciary would like to provide. And that comes with the comes with the suggestion that perhaps there needs to be a study, I think, which the two should undertake to actually find out that. That is a strong argument, except when you come to the end where Leo speaks about the opportunity costs of inadequate allocations for the executive, I mean for the judiciary, I think we'd have to disarticulate by asking ourselves what exactly is what were the things that were supposed to be funded, and which parts did Parliament not fund, or rather not approve, and for what reason. So maybe there's some sorting out of factors here and there to do, because I think that one of the lessons we carry out on the second presentation is that we need to actually, a fantastic point, if every part of government comes out, or rather if every department in government or branch of government comes out with a budget, part of their ability to persuade Parliament to support those allocations, because that implies taxes, to tax all of us to support those allocations, is to show that, look, both on a cost-benefit analysis basis, but also more specifically on an opportunity cost, if we do not receive an extra 1 billion shillings, this is the quantum of services that we'll be unable to provide, or this is how much the public loss will be on account of the fact that this is not funded. I agree. But it does not necessarily mean that, so for instance, one of the arguments that the judiciary made a couple of years back, which was both strong but actually defensively put it on its defense, was a question of buying an additional 20 or was it 25 cars? It could have been less, but something like that. And that damaged the argument, because my personal thinking is, yes, judges are very, very important people, but I do not think that between providing clerical services for a judge for efficiency in the courts to ensure that all judgments are ready on time, and buying a new car, even if you're spending, say, 10, 15 million on both, the opportunity cost for spending on the car and the opportunity cost for providing new services or a new courtroom completely vary. So I completely agree that I think the methodology that you propose for every parliament, for every state, or rather for every branch of government and every institution that makes proposals to spend the public treasure, should actually have to justify more clearly why every additional shilling or every additional billion is important. I think that stated, you provided clarity, some comparative data and all that. One of the things that I'd have sought for us to think about, and maybe you can think about this as we take the questions, is the measuring of the shortfall shows us that consistently the judiciary receives about 50% or thereabouts, right? Just what it requires. I'm not too sure what tactical behavior that means, because then it means that the judiciary, through the chief registrar of the judiciary, prepares a budget that is too ambitious, given the reality of what Parliament's behavior has been in previous years. So why do they persist with preparing a budget that requires you to spend 20 billion, when you know that last year the ability to, or rather the resources that were made available by Parliament are this, much less. So I think in consistently receiving half of the requirement, we need to actually ask ourselves whether it's tactical behavior, so you ask for much more than you need so that you know that you'll be a small margins here and there to move about, or whether those are really changes, or rather requirements that Parliament is inconsistently, or rather is consistently failing to fund, because then we need to call Parliament for why it consistently fails to provide that gap. And service provision therefore suffers. The backlog that you mentioned is part of that opportunity cost. What would be better to actually think about it, as you write up this, is it the behavior of the Kenya's Parliament to allocate just 50% of what every arm of government requires? So basically a comparative analysis of, or rather measurement of that shortfall in comparative terms. So ask yourself, for instance, for the officers in the executive, is it usually that they receive as well 50% of what they require, what they require, or is there something peculiar about Parliament's behavior vis-a-vis the judiciary? So ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to open up. Thanks a lot to both my colleagues for illuminating discussion. As I think about some of the questions that I asked, I'd like to open up this for questions. We have a chat box in here in which we can accommodate your questions. So let me start. So I'll allow two things. One, there's a facility and a menu right at the top of the floating bar which allows you to ask questions. And you can raise your hand by basically raising your hand, and I'll point to you. For those who do not, who've sent questions here, then we can actually talk about, I can read out the questions to your colleagues. So you have the option to actually either raise your hands or send it in the chat box and I'll ask the questions. Now, let me ask Leo and Jackie, because there's a question by a guest called Ayodo. And Ayodo asked, what is the performance rating of the institutions? I'm not too sure that was the function of the discussion today, but basically, because what we wanted to do was actually to simply ask, what are the allocations regarding the budget estimates that have been presented and for which an appropriations bill would issue in a couple of months. And the second question by Ayodo is, are the budgets based on manual or automated systems? Have we done costing of functions for the institutions to justify the budgets? Which is a question that Jackie and Leo were asking as well. Unless we have other questions, Leo and Jackie, please respond to those two first before we go back. So ladies and gentlemen, you have the opportunity to ask your questions through the chat box, or you can respond through the raising your hands, and then I'll point to you, and Jackie and Leo would ask the questions. Would respond to your question.
Okay. Thanks for that summary and for the questions. So I'll start basically by responding to the question that was. So Kwame has raised a few things regarding the need to follow up and establish whether the trends in allocation, whether it's peculiar only to the judiciary, the 50% allocation, or it's a pattern that we see with other institutions. And so that's obviously something that we can undertake to do. And as I stated, it is one of our current objectives as a program going forward is to basically undertake that more detailed assessment, just looking at the funding of the judiciary. And this will be a different angle, trying to also compare with other institutions, whether the under-resourcing is common or it's only specific to the judiciary. The others were broad comments, which we've noted. And then responding to the question by Ayodo, the first part, which is what is the performance rating of the institutions. So we have not come across any, rather I have not come across specific evidence-driven or data-backed, evidence-backed rating specifically for the judiciary, aside from their own self-assessment, which they do in the annual State of the Judiciary and Administration of Justice report. So that's a report that they produce after every financial year. And so this may not, well, this is their own assessment, so we can question the extent to which it's objective, because obviously you would expect that they would rate themselves very highly in different aspects. I know, for instance, the parameters of that report, it measures performance in terms of reduction of case backlog, performance in terms of development of various infrastructure projects, all of which they've rated themselves sufficiently high. I can undertake to provide the specific detail, but I know like for the case backlog, they had indicated some significant development in terms of reducing the backlog, even though they also state that the under-resourcing has hampered the degree to which they would have been able to reduce the case backlog by now. Then for the infrastructure projects as well, I'm trying to get the numbers specifically regarding how they rated themselves, how they've done based on their targets, what they had estimated to do in terms of construction of courtrooms, digitization of the judiciary in terms of their systems. So there's a number of things that they've rated themselves against, and that information is provided in this SOJA report. So that's a self-assessment again, as I've stated. So I do not have any report of another independent institution that may have rated them. But that's also something that we at IEA are planning to do, just to look objectively from the outside, how have they performed, and we can get different indicators to measure that. So that's it, and I think Leo can talk about Parliament. I think there are some ratings that have been provided by Mzalendo in the past, and other institutions, but I think Leo can respond to that. So those are the questions that I'll respond. That, yeah. So Leo.
All right, Leo, please switch on your camera as well.
So on the question Kwame raised, that whether the Parliament has a tactical behavior.
Leo, please switch on your camera.
On the question that Kwame raised about the issue of the tactical behavior that Parliament has and whether it allocates 50% consistently to other arms of government, I think that Parliament has been it's only with the respect to constitutional commissions and judiciary that we see that kind of behavior. And so I don't think Parliament has consistently allocated. In fact, what we've seen is in the executive branch is an incremental increase on the budget consistently over the last 7-8 years. Just one thing to say about and whether the budget the CRJ prepares is ambitious, and now on the costing of those functions. When there were budget cuts that were the fiscal consolidation, what National Treasury called fiscal consolidation, started at the end of 1819, and particularly when they effected those budget cuts. The argument that Maraga made, the Chief Justice Emeritus made, is that the cases filed in a year is close to 400,000. That is just for that year. What the judiciary, with the capacity it had, is able to solve 300,000. So that bringing their case resolution to around 75% of that caseload. So for him, he was pleading with Parliament and saying that an additional 5 billion would mean a lot for the judiciary. And I also want to say I agree with the arguments that Kwame makes. The Kwame made about the issue of, for example, whether to provide a Mercedes or provide a clerk, or a research assistant, for that matter, or computerization, but the efficiency questions on the spending by both judiciary can be raised, and can be raised. But at the same time, what is very clear at the onset, and from what the Chief Justice Maraga provided, is that it's clearly a clear case of underfunding. Back to you. On the rating of Parliament, there's no specific study that what Mzalendo had been doing in the past was to rate specific members of Parliament by contribution, by the number of bills, just tracking the answered and the rest. But just the rating of Parliament as an institution has not been provided. But recently, the IEA did a small sentimental analysis of institutions, the three arms of government, and which is the question they're asking members, particularly on the user on platform on Twitter, was, which is your best institution? So, and most people were able to say that it's judiciary, and Parliament came last in that list. So it's a question that is the feeling generally among Kenyans, but it stems from the Parliament's inability to control the public debt question, generally the cost of living, those kind of things. So back to you, Pam.
Okay. Well, I can see that Ayodo has his hands up. So let me first ask a question from Odundo, then I'll ask Ayodo to ask his question specifically. So P. Odundo, a guest asks, again, this is to both Jackie and Leo, the utilization rates for both judiciary and parliament raise fundamental issues about the sources of funding, given that exchequer issues are based on the budget allocations. This will require more study. It's more or less like a comment. So if you have any comments to make, you can make that response in addition to Ayodo. Ayodo, please switch on your camera and you can ask your question now. Ayodo, please go ahead and ask your question. Are you there? Ayodo, please ask your question. Okay, seems he's not able to. So fine, we'll wait for you to get yourself together. In the meantime, Jackie and Leo, there's another question in the chat box. So let me read it for you. Mr. Athanamu says, what is the proportion of grant funds mobilized from outside government by the judiciary? Is there a limit to how much they can raise in order to supplement their budgetary allocation? So basically, I think Mr. Namu would like to know what share of total spending by the judiciary is appropriations in aid or from other grants. So please respond to that.
All right. Thank you for the questions. So I'll start by responding to the first comment question on utilization rates. Sorry, I'm not sure that I got the question correctly, but okay, let me just start by addressing the question by Arthur before I come back to the other question. So the question on the proportion of the grants that is mobilized from outside by the judiciary and basically the IEA, the appropriation in aid. So I know that for the last year, the revenue mobilized within the judiciary was around 2.7 billion, if I remember correctly, but we can confirm that number. So you can calculate that as a share of basically what had been allocated from by Parliament. So I do not think that there should be a limit in any event. Any institution should actually be encouraged to raise more revenue because that again goes to their budget. I know that the judiciary reported improved efficiency in their own revenue mobilization following the digitization of various processes within the court system. And they mentioned that that was one of the drivers of the improvement because the 2.7 billion was a significant improvement in terms of the revenue that they were able to raise. So I think that basically would enable them, if they were able to even raise more revenue, that would be useful in substituting or supporting their budgets. Someone who mentioned, oh, I think now I remember, the question on the curious question on the over expenditure and that this should be investigated further. And we agree that with that comment that yes, the principles of PFM require that the utilization, or rather the expenditure, should be based on the funds that have actually been received. But when we see an over a utilization rate that is surpassing 100%, it may indicate other than receiving funds from elsewhere. Again, it could also indicate utilization of funds, that revenue that has been received, rather spending at source. So when an institution raises revenue and then proceeds to undertake expenditure on that revenue that they've mobilized, and sometimes the institutions have blamed late exchequer releases for this behavior. But it's one of the reasons that they have given in the past, that the utilization or the spending at source sometimes is due to late exchequer releases, and which tends to inhibit or limit their ability to undertake service delivery. So they end up doing that. So that is one of the explanations that has been provided. We agree that we should definitely interrogate these utilization rates further, but nonetheless, it still is an indication of at least, I would say, capacity to utilize the budgets that they have. It is. We will also look at the Auditor General's reports, the findings on that, because yes, granted, it is. The procedures that are spelled out in PFM, it may be breaching some legal requirements. So that is something that we'll follow up on and make our more detailed recommendations on that. So I think that's my first response. I don't know if there's something else that I haven't responded to. Maybe Leo can add.
All right, Leo, please.
Yeah. So on what Odundo says on utilization rates for both judiciary and parliament, that one I agree that we do further study, and that is what Judge has played that we'll do. On the question of other number of proportion of grants from outside judiciary, and what is the limit. So one of the things the IEA held a public forum, I think at the end of in 2019, and where we hosted the Chief Registrar of Judiciary, and there were also other scholars and lawyers who were dealing specifically with who gave their views specifically on this, and that they insisted that the judiciary has to be funded from consolidated fund services, and Parliament should, in its own wisdom, on the question of now this issue of costing, should be able to give resources at optimum level, because in their belief, amongst them, with the presentation of the CRJ, in their belief that the allocation at present is at suboptimal level, so that resources have to be provided at optimal levels, and they provided evidences, comparative evidence from the jurisdictions, in which particularly we borrowed largely on the 2010 Constitution. So, and that is the question that, so the belief, and I think the consensus is that the judiciary has to be sufficiently resourced from Kenya's consolidated fund services, because most of the courts that have been constructed in the last 5 years was done through a World Bank arrangement together with Treasury and Judiciary. So, and also the judiciary has been relying on development partners for other specific. It's a good thing to raise resources outside, but people believe, and experts that spoke in that forum, the IEA forum, that largely the judiciary has to be resourced from our own the taxpayers' money. Thank you.
Okay. There's Ayodo Wad is under up, and I haven't seen him raise his hand again. So I don't know whether he has a question. Please, if you do, please let me know whether you have, so that I can allow you to respond before we close, because we're going to the final round of questions. The one thing that I'd like my colleagues, Jackie and Leo, to respond to frontally is, no one's mentioned it, and I think I needed to mention it, is the Constitution requires specifically in Chapter 10, which deals with the judiciary, for the formation of a judicial fund, right? Which is basically, and what that means is specifically that once the judiciary has an allocation approved by Parliament, then the money is directed to that fund specifically, so that it can be managed directly by the judiciary and the chief registrar. Because those responsibilities for budget management actually should not be treasuries or the central banks, but should be here. The Judiciary Fund has not been established, and it's 11 years since the Constitution was formed. I think that is a very, very big infraction of what the Constitution requires. There are obvious political economy reasons, some of them based on reluctance by the Treasury. And sometimes people hear opinions from other institutions, such as the central bank, about the capability of other arms of government to manage money. Because there's nobody from the judiciary or from the JSC here who would answer that question for us, I'd like to ask you all to give us an update about what you think about it. One, I think it's a major public education question, but it's also one thing for which we should intervene with Parliament, because for as long as that judiciary fund, which the Constitution contemplated, has not been established, there's still a lot of ground. Well, actually, there's obvious ipso facto evidence that the Constitution is being violated. The Parliamentary Service Commission has its fund, it has its opportunity, it has its managers to manage its resources and who are responsible for how the expenditure is made. I think that the Auditor General should audit the judiciary through the audit, through specific audits on the ingoings and outgoings of the judiciary fund, which has not been established. I'll also open up this opportunity to any other person, because I haven't seen Ayodo back with a question. So I'll ask you, Leo and Jackie, to make any final comments, but also at the same time to make updates about how we'll take this part forward, and any other comments you'd like to make, so that we can, before we close the meeting. So let me start with Leo. Leo, go ahead.
I'll just make on the issue of the judiciary fund, but Jackie will speak into it more about it. That I strongly agree that the judiciary fund should be up by now and running, and that one will solve even the issues of disbursements, the issues of how the judiciary raises its own revenues, and all that other issues. So, but one of the things that I need to raise is that the JSC's deliberations and resolutions on this issue is something that has not been publicized, like because the JSC and the entire judiciary needs to make the case with Kenyans, to make their case with Kenyans, because as far as we know that MPs and other institutions that need to make the issue happen, including the central bank government, but the ultimate people who have a lot of say in these issues are members of Parliament. So the JSC and the judiciary should come out and make the case, the public case, just like the way Maraga made the case with the Kenyan public on the issue of the budget cuts, which effectively in that year there were no budget cuts at all, but their budget was reinstated as had been agreed by Parliament. So back to you, Jack.
Okay, thanks, Leo. So regarding the judiciary fund, yes, I'll also agree with both Kwame and Leo in terms of for sure there's a material violation of the Constitution by the fact that up to now we've not had the Judiciary Fund being implemented, being set up and implemented and executed. So the reason why the Constitution was very specific in establishing and creating this fund, if you read the Constitution in Article 1, starting with Article 160 that talks about the independence of the judiciary, you'll see that the spirit of that article is to ensure that the judiciary shall not be under the control of any person or any entity. And it states there very explicitly that the judiciary shall be subject only to the Constitution and the law, and not to the control or direction of any person or authority. And obviously, one of the ways in which any other institution or person can have control of an institution is obviously by limiting their ability to access the funds that they have, their ability to control and use the budgets. So for that reason, and to address or mitigate the risk that would come with violating the independence of the institution, this 2010 Constitution saw it fit to actually establish a fund that would be run and administered by the institution of the judiciary. You will note that there are very few funds that are actually created specifically by the Constitution. And for another independent institution, the only one that is there is for the judiciary. It's the only one that has been given that independent fund. And you will obviously see that the reason for this was basically the drafters had anticipated some challenges in terms of trying to tamper with the independence of the judiciary. So other than that, we also have the other funds that are established by the Constitution are the Equalization Fund. We also have the Consolidated Fund and the Contingencies Fund, all with very specific purposes. But the one of the judiciary is very salient, or is very important, and to address the gaps that had been foreseen by the Constitution, that fund should be up by now. I think there should even be a petition, in my view, to have this fund, and especially with the recent developments and how we've been seeing over time, the judiciary's independence being a serious violation. It's one of the things that needs to be addressed as a matter of urgency. So my view is that that fund should be implemented, and then from there, again, as Leo mentioned, it will help to address some of the things such as late exchequer releases, disbursements. Since then, it will be the CRJ or the Chief Registrar of the Judiciary who will be now tasked with the administration of that fund. So I think in that regard, and to basically enhance the place or the independence of the judiciary, that fund should be put in place. That would be my response regarding the judiciary fund. I don't know if there was any other question, but in concluding, I'd just like to state that yes, we agree that we do not just advocate for an increase in allocation of resources for the sake of it. There is definitely need. The judiciary has tried on their side to demonstrate that they are calling for a certain amount of resources to to facilitate their strategic objectives under their strategic plan. However, there is need for other independent actors to basically evaluate and carry out a proper needs assessment, basically trying to look at the functions so that we can see whether it supports what the judiciary is saying, so that we are not advocating for extravagant use of resources. The issue of CAS was mentioned, but other than the CAS, is there any other justified cause, or rather any other justified explanation that has been provided? For instance, in terms of facilitating facilitating access to court services, are those things that are legitimate reasons as to why we would advocate for more allocation of resources. I think it's important that other actors basically undertake a comprehensive needs assessment, and then we can be able to state objectively as we advocate for more resources, whether they have demonstrated that they need these resources. But as at now, what we see, the data that we have is that they are severely underfunded, and only proper evidence would help us establish whether it is justified, their calls, their requests for more allocation are justified or not. So that would be my final comments, and thanks everyone, unless there's any other question.
All right, thanks. I haven't seen any question. I've only seen some congratulatory remarks from Mr. Namu. Arthur Namu, thanks for the responses, and Mr. Nabutola, who's a member of the IEA. So thank you. I thank you, Jackie and Leo. I'd like to mention that, of course, I'm the one who mentioned the question of the Judiciary Fund. It's under Article 173 of the Constitution, sub-article 1 to 4. And I'd like to conclude by just mentioning that under 173.5, sub-article 5, it says Parliament shall enact legislation to provide for the regulation of the fund. Remember, if we read this strictly, it says that the fund is actually established by the Constitution, because it says there shall be a fund. There is established. So the Constitution already established the fund. What it means is that Parliament is violating Article 173 by failing to enact legislation to provide for the regulation of the fund. So Parliament is not even supposed to establish the fund. Treasury is not supposed to establish the fund. The central bank is not supposed to establish the fund. The fund is established by the Constitution because it assumes that the fund already exists. The only thing that's supposed to be done are the regulations to allow for the operations of the fund. So far, I think that's a big policy discussion we should have with the parliamentary committee, especially the committee on constitutional affairs. And as the IEA, I think we'll take our role more seriously by trying to get to them. Jennifer Gidegi has asked us to share the presentations. They'll be shared right after this, together with a link to this discussion for those of us who'd like to have a copy of to look at this again and to follow that. My colleagues will do not exactly a transcript, but an analysis of this in a written form, which will be sent to you, and we'll send a copy to the JSC as well, and probably to the parliamentary committees. I'd like to thank you all for attending our webinar today, and for sitting with us for 1.5 hours and a bit. Thanks a lot for honoring our invitation. And to my colleagues, Jackie and Leo, thanks a lot for making these presentations. And the function for the IEA is basically to try beyond the global analysis, macro analysis of the budgets about the broad numbers, to actually go down specifically to the micro parts, and to look at the microeconomics of, say, the judiciary and institutions, to ask ourselves, what does resource allocation mean for every institution, as opposed to the broader issues? I mean, as to the broader picture, because it's important to have a big picture analysis, but you're trying to bring it down right now to the granular analysis for the independent commissions as well as the judiciary itself, because we think this constitutional order in Kenya is as dependent on what money is available to the executive, but also how much all the functions that are supposed to be performed by these important institutions are performed. Our interest is to ensure that they use the money and the resources according to Article 201 of the Constitution, which is basically fairly, cost effectively, with high levels of prudence, and we'll continue to follow that to ensure that we can highlight, at the same time, make suggestions for how to ensure that the scarcity of resources notwithstanding, that public services get to the most adequate, get to the highest level possible. As again, I promised, the presentation will be available on our website. I'd like to remind you all that the IEA is an institution with members, so is an association, and we are recruiting members. So if you have an interest in being a member, please send an email to admin@IEA Kenya, and somebody will get back to you in order to get you to be a member of this institution. High-level discourse based on facts, and at the same time remembering that the constitutional order and institutions is what creates a prosperous society, and that creating a prosperous Kenya with working institutions is the mission of the IEA for the long term. So I thank you very much. And once again, thanks to my colleagues, Jackie and Leo, for excellent work. Have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.
Have a good afternoon, everyone.